So now I would like to thank again the Friends of Miller House who has helped sponsoring this program, especially to John Deukonis, who is the person I have been working with now for so many programs. Thank you, John, and thank you to the Friends of the Miller House. So now please welcome John Deukonis.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Joan, for the kind introduction. I am a friend of the Friends of the Miller House, Washington's headquarters, and we're thrilled to co-sponsor this program with the Chapel Library. And thank you to Ronnie Diamondstein, the president of the board of the Chapel Library, and also Joan Kuhn for all the great work that you've done in making it easy for us to put this program on, making it easy for the Friends of the Miller House. We were formed in 2010. The Friends are a nonprofit charitable 501c3 corporation that was formed to raise awareness about the Miller House and to assist the county in programming. The house was in disarray for many years, and there were countless people, friends of the house, friends of the Miller House, that assisted and encouraged the Westchester County government to fix the house. County Executive George Latimer, who's a history buff, fixed the house. And now we are off to the programming stage. We had several programs at the house before COVID, and now we've done, this is our second program virtually with the Chappaqua Library. And we're honored to do this program with the library. The house is an 18th century farmhouse in North White Plains. It was George Washington's headquarters during the Battle of White Plains. It was also the home of Anne and Elijah Miller, their children. Elijah Sr. and two of his sons, two of Anne's sons and Elijah's sons, were killed during the Battle of White Plains and just before. And Anne, nevertheless, who was a very strong woman, continued to maintain the house as a hospital throughout the rest of the Battle of White Plains and the Revolutionary War. So we hope everyone visits the house once it's opened, and feel free to visit our website, which is friendsofthemillerhouse.org. Our speaker today is Virginia Carnes, Gigi Carnes. She's one of the county's 6 curators. She gave this presentation about a year and a half ago live at the house, and we had to turn people away. It was because the house can only service about 30 people. So we're thrilled that we're doing this again. I think you're gonna love the program. She was the curator for the Miller House itself for 5 years, and she knows the contents and the history of the house better than anyone else. So Gigi, we're happy to hear you speak about the house.
All right, everybody. Hi, welcome. It's great to be here, and welcome to Treasures of the Miller House. In our Westchester County Parks Department, when we speak about treasures, we don't just mean silver and gold. We mean all the riches that encompass our 18,000 acres and some of our 50 parks and facilities. And within those, there's a riches of stories, layers of history, and objects that are connected to all those parks and facilities. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share stories about the house, the people connected with them, and the objects that are our treasures of the Miller House. So next. Up first, it's a treasure of the selling of the Miller House. Yes, believe it or not, the selling of the Miller House. So the 19th century really didn't end well for the Miller House, or the early 20th century. Next. In 1898, a newspaper clipping said that the house was unoccupied and that there were for sale signs on it. Imagine that. The Evening Post on October 21st, 1899, even reported that the Miller House was shamefully squalid with a general air of unkemptness. They blamed it on the house having been lived in by an old man with 2 sons. As the building continued to deteriorate, next. They were pleased to save what was known as Washington's headquarters. This one is from July 1901, and it says that they hope the citizens of White Plains buy it and preserve it. Next. Those pleas resulted in the 1903 sale of all the land from North Broadway between White Plains and the Valhalla train stations, including our Washington's headquarters, to the new Netherland Realty Company. They planned to save the house, but subdivide all the land around it into lots. Next. And before they could sell and subdivide, they needed salesmen, first-class salesmen at that. Anybody want to make $100 a week on commission? The Washington's headquarters plot was number 291. Next. And one local newspaper noted that it was a novel idea to save a historic house as the center of a real estate development. Anyway, while all this selling and subdividing was going on, next, there were still articles being published about the house going to ruin and the tramps had been using it. Oh no! Next. What may have prompted the renewed urgency to save the house is the injury and death of a man named William Klingen. He was hit by a train at the North White Plains station, breaking an arm and leg, and he was 65 years old, and he lived in the Miller house. And for all we know, that might be his picture on the postcard. And he received press because he joked about his injuries, but he died from them. Anyway, with his death, the house was apparently left empty, but not for long. Next. At some point during 1904, our Washington's headquarters was sold to Charles Kaiser. In 1905, they were trying to sell it. It sounded like they were trying to flip it. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle noted that the price for the house and 7 acres of land surrounding it was way too high. Next. And for years, they tried to sell it for $5,000, but there were no takers. And things began to settle down in 1916. Next. Articles started appearing again how the house, one of the most historic spots in Westchester County, was neglected. But lo and behold, in October 1916, the White Plains chapter of the DAR put an option of $100 on the property, and they had until June 1st, 1917 to secure the $5,000 that the Kaisers were asking. But where to get the $5,000? Next. The DAR petitioned the county of Westchester to buy it, and it actually took 2 votes, then an act authorizing the purchase that had to go to the state legislature. When the act was signed, it went back to the Westchester Board of Supervisors. They voted for the purchase on July 5th, 1917, and title passed to the county on August 11th, 1917. So the Miller House became a county property, and note, complete with insurance on it, with $136 of insurance on it. Next. And a board of managers was appointed to oversee operations. It included men and women, and most of the women were from the White Plains DAR chapter. So our Miller House was up and running. Couple of interesting things, though, just to keep in mind. The Miller House became the first historic property owned by the county of Westchester. It came before we owned the Bronx River Parkway. We didn't get that until 1925, and we got it even before there was a Parks Department. The Parks Department didn't come about until 1922. And next. Also, a story emerged about the house that it was saved to keep it from becoming a roadside tea house. And apparently that was a very popular thing to do at the time, and to save it from having been the Kaiser's chicken farm. The DAR claimed it had been a chicken farm because there were like chicken things in the backyard. And even the North Castle Historical Society claimed that it had been a chicken farm. And the story apparently stuck around for a while because in 1961, a relative of the Kaiser family emphatically said the house was not used as a chicken farm. Mr. Kaiser had been a local postmaster and a historian and not a chicken farmer. However, they did have a son named Charles, I guess Charles Jr., who was born in the house, who did run a poultry farm, but not at the Miller House. So there you have it, a treasure of the selling of the Miller House. And happily, that is something that can never happen again. Next. Up next, it's a treasure of the Washington bed. On July 21st, 1776, Elijah Miller signed his will. He would pass away several months later on August 21st, 1776, from war wounds he sustained during the Battle of Hellgate. And upon his death, according to his will, his dearly beloved wife Anne was to have £200 as her third of the estate after the whole is sold except the best bed, which I give to my wife. So Anne Miller inherited the best bed. This may seem really, really odd to you, but in fact, it is very typical of the 18th century. We women were not allowed to own property. And according to such 18th century luminaries as Isaiah Thomas, women, we weren't even supposed to think because it would tax our brains. However, dower rights did guarantee that a widow received a third of the estate and furniture, which is what happened to Anne Miller. Next. Beds became prized possessions, and it explains the tone when Milladora Zipporah said, George Washington had his headquarters at our house for one day and one night when my mother gave him her own bed. That was a huge deal for women to resign her bed, which that's one of the few things she could actually own. As for our current bed that's in the house, it's actually a late 19th century colonial revival bed, which was donated by Mrs. Frank Fowler, who was a member of the White Plains DAR, and she was also one of the board of managers. Next. And as a colonial revival bed, it does look very similar to 18th century beds. Many of them would have roping in them, like ours. Next. And that's where the phrase sleep tight comes from, because you would have to tighten the ropes before you went to bed. And you would have to tighten them because the bed would have a mattress on top of it that was stuffed with corn husks or straw. On top of that would be a feather mattress. On top of that would be sheets, followed by a woven coverlet or quilt, topped off by a thick spread called a bed rug. And there would be pillows and bolsters to prop a person up while sleeping. So it was a very, very layered bed, a lot of weight sitting on those ropes. Also, there is a myth that colonial beds were shorter because people were shorter. Well, that's not true. Colonial beds were custom made to the size of the person, so they could be either shorter or longer, depending on the height of the person. Next. And while we don't know what Mrs. Miller's best bed looked like, we do know that it had bed curtains. They were linen, blue and white checked damask bed curtains that daughter Martha Miller had woven. Next. And although we don't know what they looked like, we know about them because someone staying in the Miller house tried to cut them up and use them for the lining of the vest. That person was the tailor of Major General Charles Lee, and we heard all about him at the last presentation. And his tailor apparently had the curtains all spread out on the floor and was ready to cut them up when a horrified daughter, Sarah Miller, returned home and saw what was happening. She had to plead and beg, "Don't cut up the curtains, don't cut up the curtains," so that the bed curtains were saved. And bed curtains were generally considered a symbol of status. So just quickly, who was Major General Charles Lee? Next. Thomas Paine describes him as above all monarchs, but below scum. Ooh! And He was a major general who was known as eccentric. And besides traveling the war with a tailor, I mean, who does that? He had a pack of Pomeranian dogs. He lost 2 fingers in a duel, and he thought he was better qualified to run the war than George Washington, and he worked behind the scenes to discredit him. And we even think, which we learned the last time, that he was court-martialed in the Miller House. He did wind up being relieved of his duty during the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, and he was dismissed from the army, and he would have been forgotten about, but he's forever preserved in our treasures of the Washington bed because his tailor tried to cut up the curtains. Next. Treasure of Alexander Mcmillian, Welsh. Next. I'd like to introduce you to him. He's an American architect trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition, and he really gained a lot of reputation as a consulting architect in a number of restorations, including Alexander Hamilton's Grange in New York City, the Dyckman House, which he and his wife restored and donated to New York City, and next, our Miller House. He was hired by the White Plains chapter of the DAR to restore the place shortly after it was purchased in 1917. Next. And as part of his restoration, he removed petitions, including one that divided the entrance room into 2 small rooms with a hallway in the center. He removed walls and ceilings. He made fireplaces usable. Contemporary latches and locks were replaced with colonial ones. That was very popular to do back then. And a double Dutch door was installed that actually came from Yerkes's Tavern in North Salem. And that tavern was famous because in September 1780, John Yerkes and a small group of soldiers left on a scouting party, and they were the men who wound up capturing Major Andre. So, and also a porch and addition were removed, and the restoration was completed in time to celebrate the Battle of White Plains. However, that would not be the only restoration. Next. In 1946, it happened again. There were cries that Washington's headquarters was in a disgraceful condition. Next. The Yonkers Herald-Statesman wrote that the house was dirty, dilapidated, and a forgotten relic, and it was turning gray from railroad soot, and the paint was blistering and peeling. History repeats itself. Next. By 1950, the conditions were so bad that the DAR were even offering to wallpaper the front room and hang curtains. And the county was saying that it didn't have any money to do anything. And visitors were not saying nice things about it. And it was everything was blamed on the stoneworks business across the street that was said to have cast a pall of dust on everything. Next. However, interestingly, by October 1950, it was reported that bids were going out for the restoration of the Miller House. Next. This restoration uncovered stone floors and the original beehive brick oven, which was rebuilt with old bricks sourced from Rye. Old beams were exposed along with a section of the original plaster wall, and the house reopened to the public on September 18, 1951. Next. However, in 1955, rotting floorboards of the kitchen were replaced by flagstone and concrete floor that we see today. And this too would not be the last time the house was restored. Next. In 1979, the Parks Department and the White Plains DAR chapter funded a restoration project that removed the gray paint from the floors, and you can see that in the postcard down below. There was a mantle was removed from the fireplace. You can also see that in the postcard. Chair rails were removed. And the last restoration done in 2019, let's hope that that is the last restoration that ever has to be done on the Miller House again. All right, up next. A treasure of the Washington Boot. Next. Oh, and what a treasure. It entered the collection in 1951 after the restoration, and it entered the house as Washington's very own boot. Imagine that, his very own boot. Well, sadly, it's not Washington's boot. Next. It's what's known as a Pastillian boot. It was a stiff leather boot that was actually worn over another boot used by a Pastillian rider. And the Pastillian rider usually rode on the left horse of a team of horses pulling a carriage. And the thick leather kept the rider's leg from getting scraped by passing branches and chafed by the whip. Next. So there you have it. It's a treasure. It's just sadly not Washington's boot. Next. A treasure of the Miller House caretakers. Next. I'd like to introduce you to Carrie Balcom. She was the first caretaker of the Miller House when the house had china and glassware in its collection, supposedly from the Miller House family, Hitchcock chairs from them, copper utensils in the kitchen, a flag hand-sewed by Miller descendant Henrietta Miller Oakley, a handmade cradle, and Captain Daniel Purdy's drum, along with many other treasures that were on display. A lot of that stuff, I don't know where that's gone now. Next. And she actually lived in the rooms off the kitchen with the beehive brick oven. In 1925, she was paid $600 a year and was allowed $60 for the telephone, which I think that's a sizable amount of money. Her husband also altered the butler buttery and the beehive brick oven room to make them into one big dining room. Next. She lived in the house up until 1949, when conditions became what were described as too difficult. Mind you, she lived there without any indoor plumbing, running water, and the only heat coming from an oil stove for 30 years. So after the 1950 restoration, there were no more live-in caretakers. Next. Mrs. Emma E Reclaw was our first daily caretaker, and the current office, which had been the bedroom, was created for her, and she worked there from 1951 to 1962. Next. And she got to experience the house, though, with indoor plumbing, heat, and the newly restored beehive brick oven. Next. And there she is, sitting there with a whisk. And one of the oddest pictures I've ever seen. I don't get the pistol on the sign-in book, but look, there's our boot. Next. Next. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, back. Okay. She was followed in 1962 by Janet Fee. She worked until 1967 when she was replaced by local historian and Battle of White Plains President Al Siroc. Okay, next. And it's from him that we got our tavern table and our 1875 trestle table in 1969. He was also responsible for a very interesting phase in the history of the house. Next. He is responsible for mannequins. Yep, mannequins. If you think clowns are creepy, they have nothing on the Miller House mannequins. Next. They, of course, included George Washington, who apparently moved around and did different things from looking at maps to playing checkers. And there were more mannequins such as, next. This guy who appears to move around too, next. He's all over the place. And finally, next. Who do we have sitting here? Could it be the Miller family? Al worked until 1974, and he really ended sort of the era of the caretaker. Next. And interestingly, the county, too, must have been a bit disturbed by the mannequins, because on August 1st, 1969, a memo came out that they no longer wanted static exhibits. Did that mean mannequins? And that paved the way for the late 20th century focus on living history and education that brought Taryn Duffin, Beth Martinez, and ultimately me to the house on May 30th, 1989. That's when I started. And yes, those are pictures of me with the cows in front of the house. So that wraps up our treasures of our caretakers. Up next, a treasure of the great walking wheel. This is one of my favorite things in the house. Next. Our spinning wheel our walking wheel is actually a late 18th century one, which makes it very, very old. However, spinning wheels were invented in China around 500, 1000 AD, and then the idea spread to Iran, India, and it became commonplace in Europe in the 13th century. By the 17th century, they were common in North America. Next. Spinning was always considered women's work, and a great walking wheel was used to produce yarn. It twisted, combed sheep's wool, and you walked back and forth. You walked it back to draft it, and then you walked it forward to wind it onto a spool. And it was said that a spinner could walk upwards of 20 miles a day just going back and forth spinning. Next. However, for many years, it was not possible to spin on our Miller House spinning wheel because the great walking wheel was set up backwards. It wasn't until it was restored in 1991, when I was working there, that it was finally set up correctly with the wheel on the lower side and the spindle on the higher side, where in the other picture it shows it reversed. So once you've spun yarn and wove it into something, what do you do with it? Next. Well, just down the street from the Miller House, you went to the Bronx River to a fulling mill operated by Elijah Miller's uncle, Anthony. And a fulling mill was used water power, and it had hammers that pounded and scoured the fabric, and it also thickened it to make it waterproof. It was kind of like a felting process. So while the mill was gone, it was located where Rygold Chemicals was located. However, the house, believe it or not, still exists. It was built in 1725, and in 1955, it was moved from its Bronx River location to 379 Church Street in White Plains. So how cool is that? We still have another Miller House that's still standing. All right, up next. It's a treasure of the bed warmer. Next. It was the first object returned to the house after the 2019 restoration. Now it'll be famous because of that. Next. Bed warmers date to the 16th century when pans were filled with smoldering embers that would be rushed to a bed and rubbed between the sheets to warm them. Before that, a stone or a brick heated in a fireplace would have been used to heat the sheets. Next. The warming pan or bed warmer would have a pierced design in the lid, and you can see that, to allow oxygen to keep the embers glowing and to keep them going longer. And it's possible, too, that if you were using a bed warmer, you might scorch your linens if the embers were too hot and leave a burnt smell on your bed. Ugh. However, they were considered indispensable for warmth. And it's said that even Queen Elizabeth in England had one made from gold and studded with diamonds and rubies. Next. Up next, it's the treasure of the cask. This is another interesting 18th century object inside the Miller House, and it resides in the Washington bedroom. Next. The cask is actually a Dutch word, and it's one of the most iconic pieces of Hudson Valley furniture. As furniture, it served as a wardrobe at one time when there were no closets. Can't imagine that. A cask was rectangular in shape, and it had what were called bun feet. You can see those sort of round, squatty-looking feet. And the one in the Miller House, though, comes with a story. Next. And the cask came from the Fisher family. Anne Fisher Miller, it was from her family, and the story is that her brother Gilbert Fisher, who was a Whig scout who served under Jonathan Paulding, hid in the cask during the Revolutionary War. As he was hiding, Tories fired bullets into the cast, leaving holes. They're kind of hard to see, but there's sort of the white shadow in the door on the right. However, it appears that the bullet holes don't match any size known of 18th century bullets, but they suggest that they were 19th century bullets. So they couldn't have been fired while Gilbert was hiding in there during the Revolutionary War. So it's another great story, but not one that's necessarily true. Up next, the treasure of the washing machine. Next. When I started working in the house, I interpreted this as a rocking butter churn. You put your milk in it and rocked it back and forth until your butter churned. And I always thought it would have been an awful job to clean it after churning. Next. However, I would later learn that it was in fact a rocking washing machine. Next. And in the 19th century, there were rocking boxes that were both churns and washing machines, along with just rocking churns and just rocking washers. So honestly, I don't know what our box is, but what's important to remember though, next, is that a colonial family like the Millers would probably not have had one for laundry. Does everybody have their Wheaties for breakfast? Because this is the laundry process. Up before dawn to chop and gather firewood for the kettle in the yard. Haul water from the well, lots of water. Fill the kettle and light the fire. Sort the laundry. Boil the first load, agitating it with a stick. Transfer the load piece by piece to the wash tub. Scrub each piece of laundry. Try various harsh means such as lemon juice to get out stubborn stains. Transfer each piece of laundry to the rinse tub. Rinse each garment. Wring each garment. Spread each garment to dry on bushes and hang on a line. Gather or chop more wood. Haul more water. Begin the next load. I'm exhausted. How about some food for our next treasure? Next. The treasure of our grinder. Next. The grinder was a hand-cranked kitchen appliance that ground meat that would have been highly seasoned with herbs and onions. And the meat was called force meat. Next. And force meat was considered a necessary accompaniment to most cooked dishes. And a favorite thing to do was to roast a pig and use the forced meat to keep the ears erect when serving. Next. As it seems with everything in the Miller house, nothing is straightforward. Our hand-cranked box could also have been a tobacco grinder shredder. In fact, I found more images of cranked boxes as tobacco grinders than meat grinders. So again, I have no idea now, is it a meat grinder or a tobacco grinder? At this point, I don't know. It's another mystery of the Miller house. All right, up next. Treasure of the fireless cooker. Next. The concept behind the fireless cooker is that it was a metal chest, often on legs, with double insulated walls, and it was designed to hold a canister of food. Next. A soapstone plate that had been heated was placed at the bottom, then the canister of food was added, and it was topped off with another heated soapstone plate. It was sort of like a non-electric slow cooker. Next. It was very popular around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, and it also gave women actually more spare time while they were able to provide a hot meal because it did the work. It was also used during World War I. Next. Just remember, though, cooking in the 18th century was done in the open hearth. We'd have to wait a whole century or so before we got a nice labor-saving devices like a fireless cooker. Up next. A treasure of the sign-in table. This is also a piece of 18th century furniture in the house, and it has a story attached to it. Next. The story is on a plaque And it says that the table was made by a British prisoner, and it was given to a man named Major John Campbell, who was the deputy quartermaster, and he put the table in his house in New York City. One night, John was awoken and told that General Washington would shortly be arriving at his house. Apparently, Washington did arrive, and he gathered around that very table. He held a council of generals while supper was prepared and served to Washington and his officers. And the table was donated to the county in 1922. So how cool is it to have a table that supposedly was used by Washington? I have tried to research Major John Campbell, and I have not found any information on him, but maybe one day something will turn up. So anyway, up next, a treasure of the letter. Sounds mysterious. We don't have a lot of written evidence from the 18th century mentioning the Miller House, and that's why the Miller House's headquarters is such a challenging issue. But imagine to my surprise when I found an actual letter. Next. On August 8th, 1778, Major General Gates mailed this letter from the Widow Miller's house. And you can see it says the Widow Miller's house. And it's one of the few pieces of evidence we have of people really staying in the Miller house. So who was Gates? Next. Major General Gates and his aides and even Stockbridge Indians stayed at the Miller house during the summer of 1778 while Washington was at Newburgh. And Gates is famous for winning the Battle of Saratoga, and in 1800 he served in the New York legislature. Next. And there are stories about him in the Miller house, and this comes from the McDonald interviews, and the story says that the widow Miller took over the task of looking after the general. She described him as being very gentlemanly, pleasant, and that he wore spectacles. He was also something of a conscientious house guest. He told Mrs. Miller not to spend anything and that he would furnish all the provisions for the household. However, according to Daughter Zipporah, that was after he had consumed everything in the house that the Millers had. So apparently they were eaten out of house and home by Major General John Gates. What a story. Up next, a treasure of the Miller daughters. We have no idea what Anne and Elijah Miller looked like, but there's this old faded photo now at the county archives, which is marked on the back, Sarah and Martha Miller. So could this be actual images of the Miller family? Next. Well, yes and no. The photo was most likely a daguerreotype, and daguerreotype was the original form of photography, and it was in the late 1840s to 1850s when New York City was filled with what were called daguerreotype galleries, where any of the Miller sisters, Sarah, Martha, or Zipporah, could have had their images taken. Next. However, there's a little problem, though. Sarah, who was born in 1753, passed away on April 29, 1838, before daguerreotypes were known or available, so that couldn't be her. It could be Martha, who was born in 1761, but she passed away in 1852, and it could have been Zipporah, who was born in 1768, but the thing is, they would have been so very old. I just can't imagine people that old heading into New York City to have their daguerreotype taken. I think, however, this is like the next generation of Miller family members. I think it's an image of Jemina Miller, who was 93, and an unknown younger sister. Both are mentioned by writer and historian Benson J. Lossing in 1851 when he went to visit them, and he wrote about his visit. So I think it's more likely them, and it's not Sarah and Martha. However, next. There's another intriguing story about Sarah and Martha that says they carried messages in the soles of their stockings for Washington through enemy lines to the army while Washington stayed at their home. A slightly different version of that story says that they would ask the British commander for permission to go to Brooklyn to visit their brother Elijah, and that was when they would carry messages in their shoes, walking back and forth from White Plains to Brooklyn. That story was published in 1897, and it says they even volunteered to carry messages to Washington in 1778, and that they would deliver messages back and forth unharmed. Now, this isn't as crazy as it may seem. Women, because we were dismissed, we could only inherit furniture, and we were told not to think, it would tax our brains. No one would suspect us. They were not, so we made great spies. And one of the most famous female spies was one known as Agent 365, but nobody knows who her real identity is. So it's quite plausible that Sarah and Martha really did carry messages back and forth. But I don't think they were the in that photograph. And as for the Miller spy stories, those originated from the Bible, from the Miller family Bible. Up next, it's our very last treasure. It's our treasure of the Washington chair. Next. This is the stuff of legends. References to the chair start appearing in print in 1851 when Benjamin Lossing wrote in his Field Book of the Revolution that the very table and chair used by Washington had been preserved. The chair is also mentioned again in 1881, saying that the chair used by Washington had been preserved. The Lossing mention is even referred to in an article from 1899, saying the chair had been preserved. So there's all this late 19th century history about the Washington chair being preserved. Next. Then on October 1st, 1908, the Reich Chronicle reports that the table and chair used by Washington in the Miller House is for sale. Did anyone buy it? It's hard to say. I don't know. Next. So what we call the Washington chair is an armchair. As far as we know, it was donated in 1922 as a bequest from the late R. Guy McLean, who died on April 1st, 1921, with $1.5 million estate. He worked in the stock exchange and was connected to society. As for the chair, it's been preserved in postcards, supported by creepy mannequins, and caressed by caretakers, and stood next to Revolutionary War reenactors. But could it have really been used by George Washington? Next. Our rush bottom chair is marked with the name Jacob Smith, and you can see that there at the top. And according to Christie's, and I would take their word for it because they do get sued if their auction information is wrong, Jacob Smith lived from 1783 to 1845. Thus, he wasn't around in 1776 when George Washington was in the house. And our chair is also plaque that George Washington used it in 1778, which we know is not historically accurate either. Next. And I was stunned, though, when I found these Jacob Smith chairs for sale on the internet, and for an average of around $500 too, and they look just like our Washington chair. Next. And Jacob Smith was a known New York City cabinet maker and turner, famous for his rushed seated chairs. And he had a shop located at 13 Beekman Street. So it would appear that Jacob Smith wasn't around when Washington was, so how could Jacob Smith have used it? However, next, there are other chairs in the house that could be the real Washington chair, such as this 18th century Fiddleback chair that also has a plaque, and it always gets overlooked. This chair was purchased by the Board of Managers on February 2nd, 1924 of Washington's headquarters, along with the table for a whopping $400. It was purchased from Frederick Oakley with money raised by private subscription, and he acquired it from his niece, Henrietta Miller Oakley, who was willed it from John Miller, so they're all Miller descendants. So could it be the real Washington chair, since it was a style that was common at that time? Next. However, notice in this photo, there is a second side chair into the photo the chair with the plaque. And here's where things get really, really interesting. We have a record of 2 donors, but only 1 chair. The second side chair was either donated by Charles F. Halstead, who acquired it from Henrietta Miller Oakley, and who inherited it from Miller family members, or it was purchased on December 29th, 1976 by William R. Lawrence. And the chair had been on loan since 1936, and the family had purchased it from the family in an auction in 1850. So unless there's a 4th chair, which is possible, this leaves me stumped. Next. And adding more intrigue is that an 1881 article about the Miller House describes the Washington chair as a Hitchcock chair. Hitchcock chairs weren't made until 1814, although they did tend to have rush-bottom seats, but obviously they weren't around when Washington was. And it's also possible that the person who wrote the article saw the Queen Anne-style rush-bottom chair and just called them Hitchcocks. Anyway, I don't know. I have no answer. It's an epic mystery, and it's just one of those things, since so much house law is based on having the actual furniture Washington used. So next. That wraps up our treasures of the Miller House. As you can see, there are lots and lots of stories, lots and lots of questions, lots and lots of mysteries. And, you know, hopefully one day we'll be able to figure all of this out. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? I saw a couple of chat things come through, but I don't know how to respond to those.
I can read it. There's one interesting question, which is, how did the Miller House handle its existence before and after the Kensico Dam was built in 1917?
That is an interesting question. Yeah. I don't have an answer to that. I don't think there was any impact, because really all the dam stuff was really more towards the north, and even the building of the Bronx River Parkway was to the west. So I don't really think there was a lot of impact, but what a great question.
Yeah, it is great. You know, one of the things that would make one suspect that it didn't have a huge impact is that the Miller House is up on a hill, which is so if there was significant water leakage or a break in the dam, the water would flow down. I don't think it would rise to the level of where the Miller House is. But I will say that, Gigi, that I think Anne and Elijah would be really happy with your carrying on the spirit of their house in such a great way. You know, one of the things that I should mention, Gigi mentioned John Andre, and for those of you who are not steeped in Westchester Revolutionary War history, there's an interesting story there to show how incestuous the relationships were. Andre was the individual that conspired with Benedict Arnold to give the plans to West Point to the British. So when he was captured in Tarrytown, he was brought over to Armont, to North Castle, and he was minded by someone named Benjamin Talmadge, who was the head of the spy ring that included the women spies that Gigi referred to, and also an unidentified woman who was called Spy 355, who apparently gave Washington a lot of good information to assist. And one of the many reasons that Arnold wanted to defect was because he felt that Horatio Gates, took too much credit for the victory of the Battle of Saratoga, and Arnold thought that he was the one that was responsible for that victory more so than Gates was, and that might be true. But there is a group called Revolutionary War 250. I think all of the counties are going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Revolution starting in 2026. And their program is going to be centered around Andre and Benedict Arnold and their capture in White Plains, in Tarrytown. Gigi, do you know anything about the sycamore tree that's been preserved on the property?
Oh, there's stories about Washington having tied his horse around it, and that it's supposedly 200 years old. There are people who think it's that old. There are people who don't think it's that old. All I know is that it did lift up half the house,
Right.
the roots, and it kind of made the house very oddly shaped. It's a beautiful tree. It is old. It is an old tree. Whether it was around when Washington was,
right.
I don't know.
The story goes, I've heard stories that some of the soldiers from the Continental Army during the Battle of White Plains would, lie down under the tree to get some shade. And
yeah, Washington tied his horse. Yeah.
Right, and you're right. More practically, the tree uprooted the house. And there was many people that wanted to, cut it down. But thanks to the county and County Executive Latimer and the Westchester County Parks Department, the tree's been saved and it's still there and has not been cut down. So visitors of the house can see that tree and make their own decision as to whether it's just 325 years old or not. I see Joan.
John, there's lots of questions.
Sure. I don't see any more.
Okay, people ask if they could visit now.
Oh,
is it open?
The house is not open. No, it's but hopefully it will be by the fall.
Okay, and there'll be tours. Do you know?
We're going to do tours, absolutely. If you want, you can contact me if you want further information about specifically when it's going to be open. My phone number is 914-523-8085. Or you can contact the County Parks Department. Daniela Ciota is the person that's our contact with the County Parks Department. And I don't know her phone number, but there will be tours and there will be more programs at that education center of the house.
Okay. And how does this is another question. How does the Miller House compare to Hammond House near the county's grasslands reservation? Gigi?
I can't answer that. I've never been in. I mean, I remember when the Hammond House was briefly the Westchester Historical Society, but I've never been in it. I don't know what the current function or state of that house is. Good question. I don't have an answer. I don't know.
Is the Hammond House the property that's up in northern Westchester, North Salem?
No. It's on 100. No, one of the 100s. It's over by Grasslands.
Oh, okay. No, yeah, I don't know either. But the Miller House I would have to say it's a relatively modest house. It's not, a stately mansion or anything. It's just a regular little house that was a farmhouse.
Basic farmhouse, yeah. Basic farmhouse, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. I just want to have a couple of thank yous before we end the program. First, I want to tell you that it's been recorded. So if you have any friends who couldn't see this program, you could always go to the Chappaqua Library website, which is chappaqua.library.org, and scroll down and you will see a screen and you'll be able to click on one of the links to get to this program. And so all the numbers and the websites that you heard, you'll be able to copy them down. Also, I want to thank Kerry Krams, who stepped in to get this program going. We did have a lot of technical issues, and
Yay, thank you.
Issues where we couldn't see Gigi, so I'm sorry about that. And then again, of course, I want to thank John Deukonis for putting this all together, and our unbelievably well-informed lecturer, Gigi Carnes, for unbelievably a piece of property in Armonk that I knew nothing about, and now I feel very knowledgeable, and I like that.
It was great. Thank you, Joan. Thank you to the Chappaqua Library and all the other people that assisted and helped getting the house renovated. Countless people spent many, many years working on it, and Gigi, I thought that was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, all those caretakers, unbelievable. Right. caretakers and donators. So again, thank you. And please go to the Chappaqua Library website to see upcoming programs and to look at the Friends of the Miller House website to see what's going on and when the Miller House will reopen. So thank you all. And I will speak to you all soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And thank you all, everybody. Thank you all for participating. Yeah, and those were pictures of me in the house from 30 years ago. I do look a little different now.
What's the ghost in the fireplace? That's what interests me.
Oh, back in the day. Okay. Remember when you could accidentally overexpose film? That's what happened. It's somehow I managed to overexpose a film picture with like an outdoor picture, and it just looks like there's a figure in the middle of the fireplace. So that's something you can't do today because we all have digital point and shoot cameras. But I somehow managed to double expose a film. I don't know how I did it, but that's what the ghost is.
All right. Okay. Thanks everybody for coming, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.